The France 24 debate. It's day 14 of the partial shutdown of the U.S. government. We're heading towards a Thursday deadline for raising the debt ceiling, which, as our panel explained in part one of our discussion, would then send the U.S. and perhaps the whole world into uncharted territory. With us to talk about it from Corpus Christi, Texas, Susan GUGGENHEIM of the Texas Tea Party Patriots Political Action Committee. His blog is called Euro Maestro. Political commentator Jean-Pierre LaRochelle. Amine, who teaches at the European Business School INSEAD, just outside of Paris. And Philippe, chief economist at Natixis Asset Management. Douglas Herbert from France 24's International Affairs Desk also joining us in this conversation. On Twitter, some of your reactions. If the government is shut down, why are we still paying taxes? And that does broach a question. I mean, a lot of people don't really understand how this partial shutdown works.
Well, the thing is that the government is shut down if there is no budget that is voted by the House and by the Senate, and that is signed by the President of the United States. Now, part of the Republican Party is holding the entire nation and potentially the entire world hostage by refusing to put forward a bill that does not include a repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which I think is called Obamacare. I don't like that word, actually. The Affordable Care Act. And the problem is that there are about 500,000 federal employees that are furloughed because of that. That is, they are not working. And about 350,000 defense employees are still working because of extraordinary not measures, but extraordinary provisions that allow them to be to work and to be paid. Now, I think in the long run, I think both sides have a point that Republicans and Democrats should agree on reductions in federal spending because federal debt is unsustainable. But the problem is the decision-making process is that we are moving from one unsatisfactory solution to the next unsatisfactory solution, and we should take a longer, broader view of the problem of expenditures and tax receipts.
A longer, broader view, because if we don't, Douglas Herbert, we could be going from lurch from one crisis to the next.
This is exactly what Barack Obama has been saying. He's been saying politicians have basically been using brinkmanship again and again to extract political concessions. You don't really have a healthy, vibrant, full-throated debate anymore. It's all about the polarization, two parties very, very steeply pitched against each other with them really, the name of the game is trying to bring your opponent down rather than trying to seriously debate issues to get to the core of the issues. And I guess you could argue, I mean, fundamentally the problem is in the system itself. The Republican House, a lot of those seats are secure seats for certain certain Republican members in the sense that their districts are carved in a certain way. It's called gerrymandering in U.S. politics. They're carved so precisely and according to certain demographic lines that they're basically safe districts for almost forever. So it's locked in there. It's a structurally right now almost broken system, dysfunctional in that respect, which is why you keep seeing this stalemate getting worse and worse.
Nonetheless, Jean-Pierre LaRochelle, we've been talking about the onus being on the Republicans in part one of our discussion. A lot of people think the part of the onus is also on Barack Obama. On Twitter, we have a comment, if a global collapse could in fact happen, why doesn't Obama negotiate? We know there are talks taking place this Monday at the White House with senior members, but there's the feeling that Obama hasn't shown the kind of stature needed to cow down his opponents if need be, or to reach a deal.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. There's been a lot of criticism leveled at Obama. Mort Zuckerman from Newsworld reported just this last week that he's never seen such a lack of leadership in a president in exactly that, getting the two sides together. The problem is that the degree of partisanship in Washington is at such unprecedented levels of adversity between the two sides, and it's very hard for them to get together and speak, I think, at this time.
Could he be doing more?
I think he needs to be doing more. And like I said, I think it's difficult with the political environment as poisonous as it is, but we have no other choice. And it's a long-term problem, as is pointed out here, because we're talking about these short-term crises, but it's a long-term problem that's going to continue until we get to a solution. And the problem is not the debt ceiling crisis, but the budget. because the budget is what leads to these debts.
Politically, I was going to note here that the latest polls show that it's still a majority of Americans, not an overwhelming majority, but a majority of Americans right now put the onus of the blame on the Republicans for the shutdown battle. And it's interesting. Paul Krugman, New York Times columnist, maybe we could show our readers the quote. He wrote a column about a week ago in which he said, quote, he was pointing the poison political atmosphere in Washington. He said, "It's been obvious for years that the modern Republican Party is no longer capable of thinking seriously about policy. Party members believe what they want to believe, and any contrary evidence is dismissed as a hoax, the product of vast liberal conspiracies." And that in itself shows the divisions. I mean, the two sides are not talking to each other, and they're convinced that they both have their own version of the world as it is and their own truth, and never the twain shall meet.
All right, not talking to each other. The president has already played down whatever talks are taking place now, saying not all issues will be solved. So just as we had in Europe, everybody waiting for those German elections to take place for months and months and months and months, are we going to now, basically our financial markets just going to be in standby mode until the midterm elections in November of 2014?
It could be, but I think that the parallel, I come back on my parallel with summer 2011. You know, it was interesting because at this moment, it was just an ideological debate between the Tea Party and the Liberal. And it was what kind of American society do we want? And now it's the same kind of discussion, but in the middle, you have the what you call Obamacare, and it's a tangible issue for the discussion. You know, at the end, in 2011, you can discuss and find an agreement. You say, well, I do not agree totally, but in fact, it's for the goodness of the nation or whatever. And in that issue, there is clearly something very clear, we have to be very, very attentive to, is that one wants this Obamacare to be dismissed and the other not. And the point will be who will stay on the road. You know, who will keep this issue. That's very interesting. In economics, we call that a game of chicken. You know, who will jump out of the car the first and lose the situation. And the point is that maybe we on Thursday night, who will jump? And in that case, he will probably lose a large part of his credibility. And if it's Obama, it's a nightmare for the government. If it's Republican, it's a nightmare for them, but for different reasons. And so it will be very hard to manage after that.
Republican Congressman Morgan Griffith of Virginia has likened this fight to the American Revolution. He said that those fighting the British created the greatest nation and the best form of government, but they did damage to the economy in the short run. In other words, it's a fight worth having. And so what if it does damage to the economy in the short run? Susan Guggenheim, do you agree with that?
Well, in fact, I think we're always back to the same questions and answers. But right now, for sure, one of the goals of this big fight is clearly to break the spine of the Republicans. And of course, the majority of the medias are on the left, and they will blame the Republican, and that's what people hear. On the other side, facts are facts. The Republican-controlled House has voted for all the money to fund the government except Obamacare. That's a fact. Second, they have the right to withhold the money for the programs that they don't agree with. That's the Constitution, that's the law, that's a fact. Third, is Obamacare good, bad, or indifferent? That's a matter of judgment. Everybody is entitled to their judgment. But if Harry Reid and President Obama decide to continue to refuse the money to run the government, it is their responsibility.
But do you agree that like that congressman from Virginia says, that this fight is the same thing as the American Revolution.
Well, yes, and I also agree with him that we're in a game of chicken. And yes, the American people are trying to push the Republicans who are under heavy, heavy pressure not to cave in like they have done so many times. Last time we had that big debate again, that big crisis, like always at the last minute, that's coming up again in 3 days, of the reaching the debt ceiling. Again, the president and the Senate said, well, vote to raise the debt, and we will negotiate and discuss after. What has happened in the last 6 months? Have you heard of any agreement, of any discussion? No, nothing. So once again, we are getting 3 days away from that debate. And yes, it is important to try to separate the two topics. But obviously, the goal is one more time to get
Quick
to
question. Obamacare, if you want to, okay, a term that people don't like to use, the healthcare, the Affordable Health Care Act was passed by majorities in both houses of Congress. It was validated by the United States Supreme Court. And you can argue that the last presidential election partly was waged on that issue. Is there any legality even tying this issue to the government spending and to the government budget? It's a done deal. It's a closed chapter. Move on.
Well, no, we're not. Obamacare is terrible. It is raising people's premiums. It is increasing our taxes. It is increasing the national debt. It's increasing the government borrowing. There has to be a stop. And this is the time to do it.
Jean-Pierre LaRochelle.
Susan, do you think, though, even if you agree that Obamacare is a bad policy for the U.S., that it's worse risking and jeopardizing the entire world economy over this issue, over a law, as was pointed out here, was already approved by both houses and approved by the Supreme Court?
I don't think we are jeopardizing the government and the world. Again, all the money has been voted to fund everything else in the government. So those who are blocking and refusing flatly any negotiation, not even saying, it's not even about like it was to repeal it. Right now, one of the requests was just postponed by 1 year, like they have done for so many other groups. All the big enterprises have been exempted or have had it postponed. Many groups, they don't have to have Obamacare. The different religions, they don't have to have Obamacare. The only thing it's asking is that the American people are also treated the same way, and don't talk about the congressmen that are also exempted from Obamacare. So they want to be treated the same way. Let's at least postpone it until we have.
By the way, it's not just the base. The Republican leadership also saying that at this point now is the time to have this argument.
It's about stemming the tide of debt and deficits that threaten to wash out an entire generation's opportunities. Preserving the American dream. That's what this is really about. And the longer we go on settling for maybe next time, for this notion that putting things off until after the next election is okay, the harder this is going to get.
And that's the chair of the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives speaking.
Actually, if you look at some neutral reports produced by federal agencies like the Congressional Budget Office again, you actually see that federal debt is unsustainable under a variety of scenarios. That is, it's not like cherry-picking your assumptions to kind of getting unsustainable projections. But it's projected that federal debt will rise to levels that are above 100% of debt over GDP ratio, which is unsustainable. We know that once debt over GDP ratios in terms of debt reach 100%, then they go to unsustainable trajectories, and they reach a point where we have to borrow to pay the debt service. You know, it's like a household that has to borrow to pay its debt service.
And yet, Philippe WAECHTER, in 2009, the federal budget deficit, 10% of GDP. Today, there's more revenue coming in.
Absolutely.
And it's down to 4%, the largest drop in 40 years.
So no, but you know the main point we discussed a lot of sustainability, and of course we have improvement in budget deficit. But the question is probably every discussion is about reducing expenditures. Maybe we could say that could be increasing taxes. You know, it would be simpler than reducing expenditures. And that's the main point. We've seen that in California, and it could work. You know, it's not always by decreasing expenditures that you can improve the situation. And in the U.S., clearly the level of taxation is too low to even if you have a rosy scenario, you cannot imagine being on a balanced budget, even if you have a strong growth. So there is something wrong in the taxation level, and that's the real issue. Everyone wants to reduce expenditure. We have to reduce. Okay. But
let me get Susan Guggenheim in on this. Susan Guggenheim, the last election, voters in California, they had it on the ballot. They voted to raise their own taxes, and the economy there has picked up considerably. Do you think taxes are too low?
Well, I would not take California as an example of what we need to do, but our taxes unbalanced, that's for sure. Right now we have a situation where more than half of the population does not pay any taxes. And for sure it creates a very bad situation where anyway half of the population does not have a bone in what's going on. They are takers, they don't contribute to the
so what you're saying is that the poor are not paying enough taxes?
Well, you know, half of the population of the United States cannot be considered as poor. So I think maybe we need to redefine what is the poverty level also, because the poorest of the United States, I think, would be the joy and pride of most of the countries of the world. So it does not. We have also to really put things exactly in perspective there.
Jean-Pierre LaRochelle?
Well, I think the discussion is quite right here that the problem in the U.S. is primarily on the revenue side. We have corporate revenues at historically low levels. The contribution of corporate taxes towards total revenues is at 1/5 of what it was in the 70s. And so the level of corporate contribution is reduced dramatically. Corporations are paying an average of about 17% of their revenues in taxes. And as far as this half the country not paying taxes is thrown around quite a bit by people, but it's clearly not accurate, because that's just referring to federal income tax. So those people are paying payroll taxes and other taxes and are paying a much higher rate, I should point out, than Mitt Romney and other billionaires, managers of hedge funds, pay on their incomes.
Well, I would object to that. First, anybody who is on welfare does not have income taxes to pay. But also, I would agree partly, but only partly, when you say that the participation to the taxes of the corporation is maybe not what it should be. And the problem is we are right now under protection of big corporations, like we are under the dominance of big government. Big corporations don't pay their fair share of taxes. Small corporations pay an abnormal level of taxes.
I just want to remind you very quickly. Warren Buffett's plea a couple of years back, you might remember it. It made a lot of headlines. He was basically making a plea for him to be able to pay more taxes than his secretary. One of the richest men in the country, if not the world. He was pointing out that situation, and it's not exactly in his own interest to do so, perhaps.
Well, I think that was again some big show, because when you look at the level of taxes he's paying, I don't think he's either generally paying his fair share.
I'm glad that you agree that corporations aren't paying their fair share of taxes. And also, when you point out that people on welfare aren't paying taxes, I think that's quite understandable since they're not in a position to pay taxes. And I think when you were referring to half of the people or half of the population not paying taxes, you weren't trying to say that half of the people are on welfare.
All right. So I was just going to say one final point before we wrap up. We mentioned at the outset that there's divisions on the Republican side. Conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer has dubbed the 80 Republicans the suicide caucus, these 80 Republicans in the House of Representatives. Most of their districts are in the south of the United States. And we can show you a map where a lot of the dots there are below are in the south of the United States. Are we in a situation right now where there is this sort of, I guess you could say, this new ire akin to what existed in the 19th century? Some people are comparing it to the Civil War.
I think that we're at unprecedented level of divisiveness in the U.S. I think we've seen that clearly in the last elections, and I think you clearly see it in the House and in the Senate, where you see this partisanship and division at new levels. And as the rest of the people on the panel have been pointing out, they're just not talked to each other like they were able to talk to in the past. So I think it is at that point right now.
All right, we're going to leave it there for now. I want to thank you, Jean-Pierre LaRochelle, Philippe WAECHTER. I want to thank Amine, OUAZAD, Douglas Herbert, and Susan Guggenheim for being with us from Corpus Christi, Texas. Before we go, though, let's say hello to James Creedon. It's our Media Watch segment.
Evening, Francois. Le Monde's editorial today was actually on
the French broadsheet of record.
The French broadsheet of record on the pathetic spectacle of Washington. That's the headline of their editorial. And they indeed are scathing about what they call an ultra-conservative element holding the world hostage. They speak about the spectacle unfolding in front of our eyes is not alone deplorable, but a very bad omen, and go on to say that even if a last-minute solution is found, this has unveiled how dysfunctional the US democratic situation is, pointing out how a minority can basically hold the majority viewpoint hostage. The monetary and political credibility of the US is being held hostage. Now, also on their back page today, they have a piece by Sylvie Kaufmann writing from Beijing, and she says that the Asian perspective is quite similar too. If you look at the recent APEC summit in Indonesia, in Bali, John Kerry was off on the far right. I think you can see it in that photo there.
Oh dear.
Obama was being held hostage in Washington, and in center stage you've got the Chinese and Russian premiers. So she's pointing out that viewed from Beijing, for soft power, US soft power, and for US credibility, this is very bad indeed. She also points out in that article that the Chinese premier, on his way to Bali, stopped off in Malaysia. And in Indonesia, where he became the first foreign head of state to address the Indonesian parliament. So that basically America's loss in terms of weight and influence in Asia is perhaps China's gain. Now, also in the Columbia Journalism Review, they've been looking at the European papers and how they've been reacting generally to this. Bewilderment, I think, is the word that comes back most often, Francois. A kindergarten fight in a sandbox, the kidnapping of democracy, all over extending healthcare coverage, which I suppose from a European's perspective is really quite odd indeed. Now, just one more piece on the shutdown. This was in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. It's not just on US territory, it's also in France. It's hit Normandy, Francois, with the D-Day memorial sites, the American cemetery in Normandy being shut down. This is the pilgrimage of a lifetime, as the Wall Street Journal says, for a lot of US veterans coming over to Normandy, some of them now being made to climb cemetery walls to get in. So that's a pretty extraordinary image. Just one or two things during the rounds of social media. I quite like this MS-DOS piece here. America was not shut down properly. Would you like to restart America in safe mode with free healthcare, no guns, recommended? And what about this New Yorker cartoon? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the switch that turns the government on and off. This whole shutdown notion being a little bit satirised there. Will we move on to the other big media story of the day, certainly viewed from Paris, François? This is, I believe, your collector edition. You won't allow me to have it?
I'm keeping that one.
The last edition of the International Herald Tribune in its current name. It's moving on to become known as the International New York Times. Just a quick look at some of the coverage there. You've got a lot of pieces explaining. In the New York Times, they're trying to put a positive spin in it, saying, look, papers change names all the time. It's strategy, no big deal. It was once the Paris Herald or something like that. But they're also playing on that nostalgia, giving a look back on their website of all the famous front pages going back over the years. There's a little timeline up there I think you can see on top. This is all, of course, part of a survival strategy, essentially, for the paper that is going global, kind of along the lines of the Huffington Post, with editions in different languages around the world. You have, I think here, the Chinese edition. So it's all about survival strategy and making the paper profitable. And that's, I think, from Breathless. Or,
That's right, the movie
Au bout de
Breathless,
souffle.
1959.
When selling newspapers was even an erotic act, as Catherine points out.
Okay. Well, we'll miss the trib.
Yes,
James
indeed.
Creedon, many thanks.
Thanks,
I want to
François.
thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here for the France 24 debate.